will take a while.
So I should mute myself now.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, or in my case, good evening. Depends a bit where you are in this world. Up for the last blocks of sessions, and with us right now is James Hickey, and James will start to talk about domain-driven design for small organizations. James will introduce himself in the video, so I will propose that we start. James, start your video.
Welcome to Domain-Driven Design for Small Organizations. This talk is going to specifically be for engineering leaders, so think a CTO, engineering manager, but even senior developers, as long as you have some authority, I would say, and the ability to recommend changes or even implement changes in your organization. Then you definitely have the ability to do some of the things we'll talk about today. And just quickly about myself, there's my website, and you can read about me there if you want. I've written a book, Refactoring TypeScript, and that's published by Pact. It's also on LeanPub, so depending on whether it's on sale or not, you might be able to get a better price. LeanPub. I'm also the maintainer of Corevel. Corevel is an open source project for .NET Core applications, and it gives you kind of advanced abilities like task scheduling and queuing, things like that. And also I co-host the Loosely Coupled show with Derek Comartin, and we talk about software design and architecture and DDD, lots of topics in that space. So you can go on YouTube and search for the Loosely Coupled show if you want. So, as you can tell, I don't have a fancy British accent, unfortunately. I apologize. But I am from Canada, and where I live, we have the highest tides in the world. And I found a nice little time-lapse video here, just to give you an idea of how low and how high the tides can go. And some places it'll actually fluctuate up to 10 meters. It's pretty cool. It's definitely fun to live here, and I'm about 10 minutes away from the shore, so I really enjoy working remote, and I can kind of live in this area, and it's I get all the benefits of the nature around here. Now I raised this because I actually have a story that somebody told me, and I don't know how true it is, but the story goes like this. So there was somebody, I don't know who, that when the tide had went out, and it was way, way, way out, this person traveled down towards the water, and like very far from the shore, and it was very muddy. The closer to the water you get, the muddier it's going to be, because that area is usually more often than not covered with water. So he or she, I don't know, this person got stuck in the mud, and as the tide came in, the water slowly rose higher and higher, higher, and this person couldn't get out. So they drowned. I don't know how true that is. I heard it from somebody. But that reminds me of how a lot of software projects feel, and that might be the technical complexity of a project you're working on, or maybe the complexity in domain problems that you're having. And I thought this was a good segue into DDD. DDD, domain-driven design, is an approach to software development that tries to address complexities, specifically domain complexities. And those, you think of things like complex business rules or complex business processes or flows, or however you want to mention that. And so DDD is obviously very, it's getting more popular, I'd say. I think it is popular, but I think as we progress through time, more developers are realizing that the fundamentals and the principles that drive DDD are going to help them with like these really, really hard problems they're dealing with that can make you feel like you're kind of drowning in that complexity. And of course, we're talking about small organizations. Most times we hear DDD talked about in the context of large enterprise organizations. So what we're going to address is, can we use DDD in smaller organizations? Does it make sense? Are there maybe different approaches we can take? Because obviously the dynamics between having a smaller organization and a larger one are very different. So just to give an idea, this is mostly for myself to get an idea, but it was very interesting. According to the Stack Overflow in 2019, about 40% of respondents said that they were in companies that had less than 100 employees. And I'm not counting freelancers. If you count freelancers, it's a bit higher. But that's very interesting. That's roughly half, give or take. Half of developers are in smaller, what I would say smaller organizations. And take, for example, a company with 50 employees, and then you think of how many software developers might be part of that 50. And I think that would depend on whether you're a product company or if you're an agency. If you're an agency, I would probably expect you would have more developers. But definitely for a product company, you need people to deal with customer support, marketing, and product management, and all those kinds of things, right? So even in a company of 50 employees, a smaller subset are going to be software developers. So I think this talk is going to be relevant to many people. I hope so. And kind of the way I've structured this is starting out with misunderstandings. And again, because domain-driven design is a lot of times marketed or presented in context of large enterprise organizations, the question of does it even apply to smaller ones is not talked about as much. So I'd like to cover some misunderstandings that I think address that. And then we'll look specifically at startups because they do have different challenges than established smaller organizations would have. And then specifically we'll look at smaller organizations who are more established. And specifically we'll be looking at things like how do you adopt DDD, how do you learn, and how do you deal with legacy code also, because I think that is a big issue in smaller organizations that have been around for a long time. And that actually might be part of the reason why they're still small and they've existed for so long. Might be because of all the technical debt that the legacy has caused. So dealing with that can definitely help. All right, let's move ahead here. Doesn't DDD lead to over-engineering? I'm sure you've heard this many times. And the idea is, well, a lot of the techniques that apply to these big enterprise organizations, if you just cut and dry take those patterns and those techniques and then try to use them in a smaller setting, it can lead to over-engineering. And so we're going to look at, well, is that part of DDD, or is that more of an implementation that's driven from principles from domain-driven design? And that is the case. So in the Red Book by Von Vernon, Implementing Domain-Driven Design, he points out right away in his architecture chapter that one of the big advantages of domain-driven design is that it doesn't require you to use a specific kind of architecture. You could build the monolith, you could build a distributed system if you want, and you can do things like CQRS. You can make it event-driven. You can use the actor model. It's flexible, and it's up to you to think about what might apply to your own context. And another quote he had here is just about the fact that how you model your software conceptually, logically, doesn't have to be how you necessarily deploy your system. So a lot of times when people are talking about microservices, they conflate this idea of a logical component, which might be your microservice, but then the fact that you're actually deploying that same component into, let's say, the cloud or whatever, that doesn't have to be true. That those two things kind of overlap one to one. And again, you have the flexibility to do whatever you want, and domain-driven design doesn't specify to do any specific implementation that way. And so I just want to point out the core around architecture. When you're doing DDD, it's really comes down to protecting your domain logic, and that will be housed primarily in what we call a domain model. And that's going to be separated from things like architecture, data access, and like infrastructure kinds of things, technological kinds of things. And the benefit of that is we can focus on solving these tough domain problems, and then we can add data access after the fact or whatever. Another thing that comes up often, again, it comes from this whole enterprise kind of thing, is do we need an architect? So if you're in a smaller organization, your organization might be facing challenges, and one of the quote solutions to that is we need to hire an architect to drive all our technology and solve all our problems for us. And that is not domain driven. That's not a principle of domain driven design, to have one person who's dictating how to build your systems. Domain driven design is about collaboration. It's about software developers collaborating with domain experts and business people, and everybody sharing knowledge and learning how the business actually works. And ideally, once you actually understand how the business really works, and you can map that out with tools, we'll look at that later, then the actual implementation is going to be a better fit for the business. We'll just note that sometimes you might need a coach or a mentor. A lot of organizations will hire consultants or someone to help them out as a coach, especially if you don't have someone on your team who does have experience with domain-driven design or a lot of the other things around that. And again, the main thing is when we collaborate, that whole process is what drives solving our problems. And again, it really comes down to focusing on those domain problems as the core of what you're trying to do, and all the other things are kind of secondary things that you want to worry about. Agile, of course, we need to speak about Agile, but domain-driven design is not Agile because it's all about big, huge projects, enterprise projects, and in our minds we have, when you think of enterprise, you think of waterfall and these projects that take 1 to 2 years to even get pushed out to customers. But that is not the case with domain-driven design. There's this whole I don't know what you call this. The DDD whirlpool is what it's called. It's kind of like this process that you can follow, or this technique or tool. And essentially, what happens is you collaborate and you figure out, okay, we think this is the way we need to solve the problem, and then you implement that in your code, in your software as code, and then you start challenging that with new scenarios, and you go back to the drawing board, look at the model, collaborate some more, and then go back to your code. So it's a lot of kind of going back and forth. There's a lot of feedback, and that kind of should remind you of Agile, where you kind of implement a small piece, push that out, get some feedback, and then you can improve what you have based on that feedback. And that is very much what DDD requires. It's not about upfront design and just dumping everything all at once. It's an iterative process where you learn and you improve things as you move along. And it says that right in the blue book. So page 49 says DDD is an iterative process, and elsewhere it talks about how continuous integration is also very key to domain-driven design. And this is in 2003, 2004 that this book was written, so almost 20 years ago. All right, so with that out of the way, we're going to look at startups in particular for now. Actually, last week, I'm recording this in, the 14th of May. So last week, I recorded a podcast with Derek Comartin, and we had Adam Ralph, who works for Particular Software. He was a guest on our show, and Derek used an image that I really like. And the image he used is in relation to startups. And he said it's very much like you're in a dark room. You may or may not have a flashlight, but you're in the room and you can't really tell where you're going, and you're kind of stumbling around to figure out where you're going. And that's a good image, because in startups you really don't understand the full scope of the problem you're solving. A lot of times it's volatile, and sometimes you even totally kind of change the product that you're building based on customer feedback or market trends or whatever. And in Sam Newman's book, his newer book, Monolith to Microservices, he kind of lays that same idea out, that there could be huge shifts in the original vision of the company, and he makes a recommendation that you should only split, and he's talking about microservices, but I think the same applies talking about domain-driven design and bounded context. Now, he recommends only split around the boundaries that are clear at the beginning, and I would agree with that, and then keep the rest on the monolithic side. And the idea is that if you do that, once you do figure out where your boundaries are and you have more clarity of your domain and what you're actually trying to solve, and it's going to be much easier to create boundaries out of that monolithic structure, as opposed to splitting around the wrong boundaries, and then you discover, okay, actually we split this completely wrong, and we've got to bring everything back in and then split across different seams, and that's much harder to do. And so, especially for a startup, I think it's more helpful to maybe start off with a simpler architecture. And of course, if you have a piece that you need to split up, then makes sense, do it. And I have about three charts or images here I want to go through, and I think they just highlight kind of the realities of being in a startup. And I wanted to just lay that out visually. Maybe that, I know a lot of people, it's easier for people to see that visually. So on the left-hand side, we're in year one of our startup, and the top is kind of the product, or we might even look at this as a bounded context in DDD terms, that we're focused on this intensely, and we're putting all our resources into it. And the bottom product 2, is a bit lighter. That is more of an internal thing, or maybe a secondary supportive product or tool. But then we move along to year 2 or 3 or 4, and then we realize that for whatever reason, the other tool we were building, or in that other context, product 2, is actually more useful, and that is gaining more traction than product 1. And so you kind of have this paradigm shift, or you have a shift where now product 2 is your focus, and product 1 is maybe it's stable, so you don't need to really do anything about it, or maybe you want to kind of ignore it for now. And one example is Slack. So Slack started as an internal tool, and then eventually they decided, well, actually this is gaining traction, and we want to release this as an actual product. And so they switched their focus. I think they actually started a new company to do that, but whatever, it doesn't matter. The idea is that they had this tool that they were using, and they totally switched their focus. And the fact is that happens in startups. So for startups, definitely being flexible and not, again, not trying to split things up too much at the beginning can help. And so there's this or the question, I guess, of you're in a startup, so you need to move really fast. Is it worth investing all that time in this collaboration, or should we just kind of pump out features as fast as we can? And I think collaboration is important, and this is not a scientific graph. It's just kind of I just drew it. It's not scientific at all, but I think the principle applies, and the principle being that if we do invest in collaboration up front, we're going to see massive gains. And of course, short term, you may not recognize the gains that you've had. Definitely long term, you will. And I think we'll move on to the next slide here. This is kind of more like a practical application of that idea. And so on the bottom we have time, and then we have on the y-axis is kind of the value we deliver to clients. So if you imagine you get client requests, oh, we want this feature and we want that feature and this feature should do that, and we have a report and this report should show this data. If we don't collaborate and we don't probe into the real needs behind that request, then you look at the blue line, and ultimately you're just going to get kind of this cobbled mess of features that really, a lot of times, they may not even make sense to when you kind of stack them all up together. You realize, oh, this feature actually like conflicts with this other feature because we didn't think about it. You definitely get into a world of hurt when you do that. So if you collaborate and you explore the domain when people have requests for features, I think it's kind of a no-brainer that it's helpful to dig into those questions, or dig into those requests and ask questions and collaborate in the domain. But of course, if you're in a startup, I mean, do that as much as you feel is necessary, but I think you have to do that. It's going to take a sip here. So all that being said about startups, how do we build like a strategy to fix that? What tools are there to facilitate that? And of course, event storming is probably one of the bigger, most helpful tools that we can use. And I'm not really going to cover it that much because, I mean, you can just Google event storming and check it out. I would say if you're in a startup, event storming, using that as a collaborative tool, using that as like your starting point to start doing collaborative design and figuring out requirements and probing potential features, basically everything we just talked about. This is a great way to explore those things. I personally like to start with just the events. Forget about like the commands and policies and all that. Just lay out the events. I think that in itself is a good starting point. It's kind of simpler and you can move a lot faster. And then if you feel like maybe there's an area of the domain that is maybe not as easy, and it seems like there's a lot of contention or issues in this particular area, then I think you can start introducing some of the other concepts, like the commands or policies or whatever. And we'll talk about context mapping, and I think context mapping can be helpful in startups. And again, this requires you to kind of examine where you think your boundaries might be. Why I bring this up is because it does help you to make decisions like, should we build this subsystem or should we buy an off-the-shelf product to help us with this subdomain or this kind of area of our business? And so you can imagine like identity, for example. If you're a startup, you don't want to build a whole identity infrastructure. it'd be much quicker, much simpler for you to use a third-party product like Okta or Auth0, or AWS has their own, Azure has their own, everyone has their own. But just use like a cloud service to do that. Same with payment. If that's not your core domain, then just use PayPal or Stripe or whatever. Don't build your own. That might make more sense for you. And then again, you look at things like order. Is that actually your core domain? If it is, then you probably want to handle that, like building custom code to do that. Shipping, again, you need to think about, do we want to buy an off-the-shelf product to handle shipping, whatever it might be. It might be physical products, or maybe you're dealing with physical products and digital products. Like if you sell books, maybe you sell ebooks and physical books. So is there something that we can buy that can help us manage that? You don't have to build it yourself. So those are definitely questions you want to ask. Context mapping, very, very simple. It helps you to kind of think about that. Other things you can use context mapping for example, are hiring. So if you map all your contexts out, you might decide, actually, we're not going to implement the shipping context yet, or maybe we're just going to implement like a really primitive version of the shipping context, and we're going to focus on building out the ordering piece and all that stuff, get that working. Then as a startup, you get to your next phase of investment or whatever, and then you decide, okay, now we need to kind of add more resources to the shipping area. But you would have already known this up front, so you probably would have. This would be a way to realize, yeah, we're going to have to add more resources to the shipping piece at some point in the future, so you can ramp up and start to prepare for that. And of course, this is a simple map. You might have way more, depending on your business. And again, just things like, where do we want to invest our money in? And that comes back to whether we want to buy or build. So asking those kinds of questions is very important. Now, I'm not going to cover the tactical pieces. A lot of those the things we just talked about are more the strategical tools. I will say about the tactical tools that they are important. I think the problem we have as software developers is we view the tactical tools as coding patterns, and that's not what they are designed. They're modeling patterns. So you should be able to use things like value objects and entities and aggregates. You should be able to kind of decide what those are going to look like before you even code, ideally. And then again, this comes back to this whole idea that there's the whirlpool model, where sometimes you're actually in your code and you might actually realize, hey, these two concepts look like they're the same, or they look like maybe they should be tied together somehow. Then maybe you want to go back to your domain experts and have that discussion. And sometimes that happens, right? So you're collaborating with the domain expert, you get this new breakthrough. But that also happens in code. You get a breakthrough, or you get this kind of realization, and you bring that back to the domain expert and play around with that. But definitely the tactical tools are important for solving those really nitty-gritty problems, like once you've defined your bounded context and you're actually digging down and solving those actual domain problems. The tactical tools really help. So there's a link here for the about aggregates that Von Vernon wrote, and I think that's based off a chapter in his book. So either or, I think, are really good resources for that. All right, let's take a drink here. Let's move on to established organizations. All right, so I mentioned at the beginning of this, a lot of established smaller organizations, even larger ones, probably have legacy. You probably have a big ball of mud a system or a web of systems that just maybe hasn't been designed well, or just through time there's been technical debt that has accumulated. Sometimes you might be in an organization that historically has been what we call a feature factory, which again is just clients ask you to implement a feature and you do it, and you're throwing new features all over the place, and there's no strategy around whether users are actually going to use it or not. And then some features might actually contradict each other, and you don't realize that because you're not actually planning these things out well. So how do we deal with those kinds of issues in some of these smaller organizations? And specifically using domain-driven design principles to attack these things. So some of the challenges that you will face and that I will face and in these kinds of organizations are what I call these ingrained poor processes, and you can usually tell what these are when people say, well, we've always done it like X, we've always done it like this. We've always deployed things through FTP. Why should we automate a build pipeline and all this stuff, right? Oh, we've never tested, so it's worked fine. Those kinds of things. Lack of skills, that is a big issue too, and we'll cover that. And then, of course, legacy. So when you are in an organization that has these ingrained processes, it's definitely harder. That's a roadblock to doing domain-driven design. And again, this comes back to this idea that if you have some authority in your organization, maybe you're a CTO, or maybe just you have built some trust in your company, it's going to be much easier for you. And I would say that's the first step. If you're interested in doing DDD in your organization, but you haven't done anything yet, first thing you need to do is gain the trust of everyone, or the trust of your colleagues. And then the other idea is to start introducing things gradually or incrementally. I think if you start dumping everything on your team, that's going to be very hard, very difficult, and there's too much new things for people to learn. And another recommendation is to start off with smaller projects. You can even do pilot projects. Eric Evans talks about this in a paper he wrote. I think we have a quote from that paper later on, but he suggests doing pilot projects and introducing these domain-driven concepts, seeing how they work, and then moving from there. And then again, if you feel like you don't have the ability to do some of the strategical stuff we've already talked about, which those things actually they also apply in this case, it might be helpful to start with the tactical patterns. It's not ideal, but it is a way to start improving the way you're building software. So, and that's possibly part of gaining trust too, is this can help you to build more maintainable software that's more reliable, easier to understand and maintain, and all that good stuff. So lack of skills, of course, if you're doing something new, then that's clearly a challenge. I'd mentioned this before. It does help to have a coach or a mentor, somebody who has experience with DDD, and you can kind of have them coach you through the process. Using the strategic tools too is helpful, because you can decide what contexts need to be attacked carefully, and then you can perhaps use some of your better resources to deal with those. And then maybe if you have more secondary contexts, you can those who are maybe more less skilled or not up to date, then you can use those more secondary contexts, or the smaller pilot projects, to kind of give them a chance to learn some of this stuff, but not in a less critical part of your system. And pair programming, mob programming, that's going to help a lot too, is if you kind of all get together and walk through, we're going to build this this one small feature together and talk about what patterns we might use or what techniques or how we're going to model this out first. And you should be doing this anyways if you're doing the collaborative stuff. So that's kind of the next step is we've built a model, and now we're all going to get together and we're going to try to implement this, what we've already kind of conceptually imagined. So a few tips for starting out. Feature folders is, again, coming back to this idea of you don't want to split things up too much up front, especially if you're in a startup. But if you're just learning DDD, also you kind of want to take baby steps. You don't want to go all out and start building microservices right away or things like that. So feature folders is basically instead of organizing your code in technical concerns, so we've got a folder for enums here, we've got a folder for all our controllers here, and all our classes are in one folder. Think about how your business is organized, and then structure your code according to your products and maybe the features they have. And then if you do things like event storming, or you can figure out where your boundaries are, then you can create a folder structure based on that. That's definitely a good starting point, just to help make the code easier to use. Value objects from maybe a lower level perspective is very helpful. Definitely just that alone can help your code become more maintainable, easier to understand, things like that. CQRS, that can be helpful if you just keep it to the code level. So instead of having a class where you're using the same class to write data to the database and also using that same class to display on a UI, you'd actually split that up. So you have a dedicated model or a dedicated class or function or whatever if you're doing functional programming, or an object. One that's only for writing, and then a separate one that's only for reading. And that keeps things less muddled. I'm going to skip through the other ones. Basically, keep your infrastructure separate from your domain logic, and that way you can unit test your domain logic easier, and it helps you focus in on the problems there. So legacy, how do we build new stuff when we have all this legacy and it's really hard to add new features to this existing system, and we have new features that the company wants to build? How do we deal with that? Eric Evans has he has a few techniques, and there's a link here to an article you can check out there. And so he has this first idea he calls bubble context, and you can go to that article and check it out. But that's definitely a good way to get started if you're facing these problems and you want to get started with domain-driven design. And we're just going to do a little use case here to maybe show what that might look like. I will say don't do a rewrite. If you're doing domain-driven design, don't say, okay, we're going to rewrite our entire system using domain-driven design. That's going to end very badly for you. And domain-driven design actually suggests not to do that. The whole point of domain-driven design, one of the points of it, is by mapping out what your context, different boundaries are, different pieces of your domain, then you can address each one of those individually. There's less risk and you can be more focused. So there's a case study here. We'll just cover really quick. I'm running out of time here. You can go to my website. I have an article where I talk about this, but basically there's a legacy system I worked on, monolithic database and lots of web applications all talking to the same database, really hard to modify. So one of the first steps we took, or that I helped them with, is we kind of made this new .NET project in this case, and we started building all of our new features using more of a domain-driven kind of structure where you have all your domain logic in one place and all your infrastructure around that. And then we did things like you can start testing your logic, use automated tests in your builds and things like that. And then when you're building these features, you basically build it as a sidecar onto your legacy. So you build a new feature, it's going to, as much as possible, have its own database tables. Um, all the code for it is going to be not tied to the legacy as much as possible. And then you're actually going to build a new UI component for that feature. And for example, this might be like a dashboard or maybe even a widget on a dashboard, or you might have some page part of your system where you have tabs. Oh, and we need to add this new tab that has kind of this new information from this new feature. So what I help them with is we introduce Vue.js, which is great, and you can build UI components using Vue.js that will talk to the back end of the new feature you built. And then you can just drop that UI component into your legacy, and it works out of the box. It knows that it needs to communicate with the new API that you have. And so you can enhance and add features to your legacy system, but you can do that kind of in a new way and gain the benefit of having automated tests and things like that. So roughly, that's kind of what it looks like. Is you have the legacy and you have newer features that are built, and you compose them all in the UI. All right, so DDD misunderstandings, we addressed those, and I hope you can see that DDD is helpful for smaller organizations. And then for startups, definitely you want to focus on your core domain and definitely get into collaboration and use the tools that we talked about. And for established organizations, again, be careful, do it incrementally. You want to train everyone around you, collaborate when you're figuring things out, and try some pilot projects and see how things go. All right, thank you so much, and hope you enjoyed this. If you want to connect with me, my Twitter thing is down there. Once that disappears, you can message me on Twitter or whatever, and if you have any questions. Thanks. Enjoy.
Okay, James, thank you very much for that interesting session. We're running out of time a bit, so I saw some Q&A already going on the YouTube chat, which is amazing. If there are more questions, just put the conversation either on Twitter, use the hashtag with 5xD, or go to the DDD CQRS Slack, which has a virtual DDD channel. The link of that is on the virtual DDD website. Thank you very much again, James. Interesting session. And join us in 15 minutes where we'll have the last panel session of today where we talk about experimentation. Again, thanks, James.